Talking about PhpUnit, unit testing in PHP, and I'm going to start by going back to a framework that I used a few weeks ago, the Slim framework, and this project is based on the Slim skeleton with a few of my hacks on top of it. This is all the stuff that we did a month or two ago. You can see I added a few dependencies. This database dependency was added, and if we look at the routes, we've added a few test routes. So we won't be doing any new routes today. We're just going to work on a service. I've created a useful service here, and I put it in my service directory just to keep things organized. I also created a repository, which is it's kind of an interface between the application and the ORM, which helps you kind of keep things organized within your application and not spread your ORM code throughout your services. You can keep your SQL and other database access things inside a repository. So this repository is very simple. Hey guys. Everyone was in the other room, huh? Okay. So this repository is very simple. It just expects to receive a PDO connection on the construction. And then it has one method, which is just select major clients. This is just selecting all the clients from a client table, although you would probably have a few where clauses to attach to this to select the major ones. All right, and then in my service, the service is expecting, when it's built, it expects to receive a copy of that repository and also the logger interface. Now, the Slim framework uses monolog as its logger, but here I've just specified the interface, logger interface, which is PSR log interface. And if you remember, if you've dealt with interfaces before, there's no code behind this. These are just a specification of the methods that need to be implemented in order to comply with that interface. When this gets instantiated, when the service gets instantiated, it needs to receive a log object that complies with that interface, and it doesn't care if that's monolog or something else. So it could be some different kind of logging service. This gives us some flexibility when it comes to testing. You see, the only method really in this service is just a little process here that calls that repository, selecting the major clients, and then looping through the major clients and printing their name into the log. So very, very simple. And then it returns a count of the clients. So this is all the supporting stuff. This is what we're going to test. Now, generally, we have our tests in a separate directory here. I've got actually the Slim framework, when you first install that, has this test directory, and it has a couple of base classes, sample tests. This one, the base test case, is used for inheritance. So every other test is going to extend the base test case, which is extending the test case from PhpUnit. Now, I did make one change on this earlier. This, as it came from in the Slim framework, it had the name here was PhpUnit framework test case. Okay, this class no longer exists because we're going to be using the more recent version of PhpUnit, and all of these former long names like that have been changed so that they are PSR4 compliant. That is, they have namespaces now, like this one. So this is the one change that I had to make here. Use test case. Okay. Okay, so if I'm going to use PHPUnit, I have to install that. And I'm using Composer on this project. So it's real easy to install PHPUnit if I type correctly. Type the right name. So just do Composer require PHPUnit. That will install it, and it will add it to the requirements in my composer.json file, which is the control file that Composer looks for. But if I do it just like this, it will add it into the require area. And this is only, this PHPUnit is only required when I'm doing development. So I really want it in required dev. And then to do that, I need to add a tag here to tell it this is a dev requirement, not a production requirement. That way when I deploy this into a production environment, it would not load PHPUnit. Okay. So we run that. I have Composer installed globally, so I don't have to prefix that, or I don't have to use the far file. Okay, now it has added, Composer has added this little section here, require dev, with PHPUnit in it. And it's picked up version 7, which is probably the latest. And while I'm here, I'm going to also install Mockery, which is a library for creating mocks. Also, that's going to be a dev requirement. And there it is, require dev. Now, I could have added these here manually into the require dev and then run Composer install, and it would have picked them up from that file also. But okay, so now I have this test case exists out there. It's actually placed it under my vendor directory. So there's PHPUnit, all of its code, and there was a lot of it. And also at the same time, Composer creates an auto load file right here. So I need to add that to my application. It's probably already a part of this application, actually. But when I start to run a test, I need to pick that up. Now, there's also, the Slim framework comes with a PHPUnit XML file, which has some control information in it. It tells PHPUnit how to configure itself. And it already has this autoload file there as a bootstrap. So it already knows to pick that up. But in other cases, when you invoke PHPUnit, you might have to specify that, and you can do it from the command line. Because I installed it with Composer, there is a bin directory down here under the vendor directory, and it has a little executable file. It's just another PHP script. But it's, so I can invoke it that way. Sometimes you might have to do bootstrap. Again, I can't type at this angle. It's weird. Okay, you might have to specify the bootstrap right here. Okay. Now, that just ran 3 tests. Those 3 tests are here in these files. And also, it's probably counting this one, but this file doesn't include any tests yet. So let's go start writing that. That's the whole purpose of our demo today. Test classes need to, for PHPUnit, need to end with TEST, right? So this is the useful service test. It's in a directory that mirrors the location of the surface itself up here. And the name is also similar. That's not required, but just a way of keeping organized. Test methods need to be public, and they need to start with the word test. So I could leave it like that, actually. But I like to name them after what I'm testing. So in this case, I'm just going to name it process. Sometimes if I'm writing a test for exceptions, I might include that here, like when there's no clients, there might be an exception thrown. So I might name it some way that's going to remind me, because those method names are going to show up in the output of PhpUnit, so you can see, maybe it gives you a clue to what you were trying to test. All right, so to test this thing, I'm going to need to invoke the service with, and call that process. So I need to create that service somewhere. And generally, all your tests within this file are going to be using the same kind of objects, so it's good to create those in the setup method. Tell it it's a function here, okay. Okay, this is a function that PhpUnit will call before every test, before every method that it runs as a test. So if I had 4 different tests in here, test process with no clients, test process with something else, it would call setup every time before it ran each of those. It would call it 4 times. All right, so here I'm going to create my service. First I have to remember to call the parent setup method. Okay. Now I'm going to create that service here. That way I can share it. I don't have to create it in every test method. And I want to get the Slim framework to create it for me. I want the framework's container, dependency injection container, to create that service for me. Okay. I think that's the way I want to call it. Oops, I missed something. All right. In order to make this work, I have to have a dependency over here that tells the container how to construct that service. So I like to use the name of the service as it's, you can use anything here. I could just type in XYZ as the index for this particular object, but then I have to remember what I put, right? So I like to use the name of the class itself. And then I define a function that will instantiate a new object here. The $C right here is the container itself. So when this function is called, when you request useful service from the container, it calls this constructor function, and the constructor function then has to build the service. Okay, so in order to build that service, I need to give it a repository and a log. And there again, that's where this container comes in handy. I'm going to tell the container to build that too. And then, whoops, deleted stuff I wanted to keep. And the log. If we look up here just a little further, right at the top of the screen, I've already got a constructor function to build the logger. So all I need to do is tell the container that I want the logger. Okay. And you can see it's implementing monologue here. It's building a monologue logger. That's the implementation of that logger interface. That could be swapped out with something else as long as it's compliant with the interface. All right, now I told it I want it to build the indispensable repository. So I better tell it how to build that too. Okay, and when I build this one, I have to give it the PDO connection. And again, the container already knows how to build that. And it calls it database. So I just tell the container to give me a copy of the database object. All right, now that should get both of those built. Okay, that's the service. Where's my test? Here's my test. All right. So when I tell the container to build me this useful service, it's going to go to all of its constructor methods and spin up the database and the logger and the repository and build all of that stuff in the background and finally hand me back this useful service. But in fact, that's not what I want to do. When I'm doing a test, let me just minimize this stuff. When I'm running a test, I don't want the real database. I don't want to talk to the database. That's slow. I'd have to have all that network lag and all that. I'd have to set up data in the database to make sure it was there. I just want to skip the database. In fact, I think I'm just going to skip the repository too. I want a mock instead. I want a pretend version of the repository. So to build that, I'm going to use Mockery. And I tell Mockery the name of the class that I want it to build, and it's just like the container, it builds that. It builds something that's compliant with that class. It looks just like that class, has all the methods. Except that those methods don't do anything until I tell them what to do. And then I have to tell the container that when you build the indispensable repository, now instead of that, I want you to use my mock. So to do that, I'm going to replace that thing that I just built over here. I'm going to replace this function inside my test. There, get the right file. And instead of returning a new thing here, I'm going to return the one that I just built. Okay. Now, to make my life a little easier, I can create this thing at repo and tell it that it's actually a mock here. I'm telling PHP Storm, which is my editor, that this is Mockery mock. And now when I come down here, it will know that. And it will help me out with some function names. So when I'm actually running this test, the repo should receive a call to, what was it, select major clients. Okay, and it should receive that at least once. In fact, exactly once. And it should return, let's have it return an empty array for now. Just let it go at that. See how that works out. Okay, now I need to do the same thing with the logger. I could run it like this, and it would just actually create log entries. I don't want it to do that. We're going to mock the logger too. I'm not going to mock monologue. I'm going to mock the logger interface. Okay. And then I have to replace this. Okay. And I'm going to put that up here too, just so I know what it was. Okay. When I put these kind of comments into the editor, it helps PHP Storm know what class I'm using there, and then it can prompt for things like the should receive. It tells me, and I don't misspell receive, which I frequently do. Okay, so this log, except I still can't type log, should receive info. That's a call to the info method. And I'm going to say that's at least once. Now I could get specific here. I could tell it times. I could tell it instead of this part, I could have said how many times it's going to receive it. I could say it's going to receive it 5 times, and then it would actually check to see that that happens. But in this case, I don't really care so much how many things are going to the log. I just want to make sure something happens. And I don't have to put a return on this. There's a lot of different things you could return. You can return null, true, false, whatever you want to define in here. There's some shortcut methods. If you have an object that's returning this so that it's chaining, you can chain into the next function. There's a shortcut here to return self. That's kind of a neat feature. But in the case of the log, I don't need to return anything. Okay. And then the service is supposed to return something itself. So let's capture that and test. Okay, so here we're finally getting to the point where we're going to write an actual assertion. What's the matter with that? Okay, that should be prompting me. So I've done something wrong. And that's what it is. I have not extended my base class. Okay, so if I extend that base class, let's go look at it. The base class is extending the PhpUnit class, and PhpUnit, if you look down here, has all of these assertions and expectations and all kinds of other things. All of those become available to me when I extend that. All right, so test class. Okay, now I've got all of these assertions available. And I think it's going to return a number. So let's just say it's going to return 5. Okay, so there's my test. It looks like just one assertion actually, but there's more to it because I'm saying it has to call the repository at least once, and it has to call the log at least once. Okay. Let's see how we run here. And I don't need this bootstrap thing now because that's in the PHP XML, remember. Okay, something blowed up. PDO exception. Now, why did I get a PDO exception? It's not supposed to be using PDO. So I should be getting this repo, which is a mock. And that should not be hitting the database at all. Oh, maybe that's it. Telling it to create the useful service, so it goes to its dependencies, and it says to do that I do this, and I need the repository and the logger. I've replaced the function that creates the repository, so it should be using my repository here. So we can see from this trace down here, it's hitting line 30, that's the repository, and then it hits line 36, and that's here. It should not be doing that. It should not be going to this one. So what have I done wrong? Anybody see it? Oh, this container, okay. This is not the container. I don't have an object named container here yet. I need to be saying this container. Yeah. Okay, that should make a difference. There we go. Yeah, now it says failed asserting that 0 matches expected 5. So my test here, assert equals 5. But I returned an array from the repository that was empty. It has 0 objects in it. So I need to give it something in here. Let's give it 5 objects to return. Okay, if I do that, now it blows up on something. trying to get property of non-object in useful service 32. Okay. Well, line 32 is this log info and client name. So here's the problem. We're returning clients, and then each client needs to be an object that has a name. So I could, maybe this is showing me something that's wrong with my class. Maybe I should be saying if is set or not empty or something. Maybe I should be doing it that way. And that passes, but it also might not be what I want to do here. I could also give it objects here with names. So, and again, I don't want to use real objects. I don't want to create client objects. I'm just going to use a standard class here with a name, like that. Okay, that worked. Info got called, and it returned 1. So I really need to give it 5 of those if I want it to match, or no, I'll give it 3. And then I'll change the test. Okay, I'm only giving it 3, so I should expect it to return a result of 3. There we go. Now we pass. Okay. So did we get all the calls that we expected to log? Let's say we expect it to call log times 5. And that passes, but it shouldn't be 5, really. It should be 3, right? It should be calling the log info 3 times. So that should not pass. Again, I've forgotten something. And that is I need to tell Mockery to check those expectations. I've set up the expectations here, but I haven't checked them. So I do that here in the teardown. Okay, oops. That's a mess. Can't click on anything. Hang on. Okay, just want to clean some of this up. Okay, first I'm going to call Mockery close. Now that's going to give Mockery a chance to check those expectations. When I told it has to call it at least once or it has to call it 5 times, Mockery's going to check now and make sure that it did call those. So not only do I have this assertion in here, I also have these other things as tests that these have to pass in order for the whole test to pass. And it blew up. Hang on. Okay. So the logger interface should be called exactly 5 times, but called 3 times. That's because I wrote the test wrong, isn't it? Because I only gave it 3 objects to call it. There we go. Now we got a clean test. Okay. Okay, so that's basic PHP unit testing. And that's really all I wanted to accomplish today. So any questions, guys? You want to see any? You have any questions on how any of it worked? Okay. Feel free to come up afterwards and, if you want to see this code or ask me about it, that's cool. All right, thanks for coming. Kimberly, thanks.